subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real code of the samurai, not paraphrased, not softened. In 1899, a Japanese economist named Inazo Nitobe sat down in a sickbed in California and wrote a short book in English, for an audience that had never read it before. Years earlier, a Belgian jurist had asked him a simple question that stuck in his mind: if Japanese schools teach no religious instruction, how do you teach your children right from wrong? Nitobe had no immediate answer. The question haunted him until he realized the moral education of his country had never come from a church or a temple. It came from a code carried by its warrior class for 700 years, a code so woven into ordinary Japanese life that no one had ever needed to write it down as a system. He decided to write it down himself, in English, so a Western audience raised on chivalry and knighthood would have a real reference point instead of a caricature. The result was Bushido, the soul of Japan, and its opening line has outlived every argument made against it since. Chivalry is a flower no less indigenous to the soil of Japan than its emblem, the cherry blossom, nor is it a dried-up specimen of an antique virtue preserved in the herbarium of our history. Bushido means, literally, the way of the warrior. Not a religion. Not a single book handed down by a founder, the way Christianity has its scripture or Buddhism its sutras. It was an unwritten code, absorbed the way a child absorbs manners, through example, through correction, through the accumulated weight of an entire class of men who stake their lives on living up to it. Nitobe compares it directly to English chivalry, and the comparison holds up better than you'd expect. Both were codes for an armed aristocracy. Both demanded more of the strong than of the weak. Both eventually outlived the battlefield conditions that created them and became something closer to a moral education for an entire nation. What did that code actually demand? Nitobe organizes it around a small set of virtues, and we'll spend individual videos on each one in the days ahead, but the shape of the whole thing is worth seeing at once. Rectitude, the samurai's uncompromising sense of right and wrong. Courage, which counted for nothing unless it served justice. Benevolence, the obligation of the strong toward the weak. Politeness, which was never mere etiquette but respect for another person's feelings made visible. Veracity, a standard of honesty so strict that a samurai's word required no contract to back it. Honor, a public dignity a warrior would die rather than surrender. Loyalty, owed upward to a lord even at the cost of one's own family. And self-control, the discipline that kept all the others from collapsing into performance. None of this was theoretical. Nitobe is blunt about what these virtues cost the men who held them. Life itself was thought cheap if honor and fame could be attained therewith. Hence, whenever a cause presented itself which was considered dearer than life, with utmost serenity and celerity was life laid down. That's not a slogan. For 7 centuries, Japan's warrior class organized its entire understanding of a life well lived around the idea that some things are worth more than staying alive, and built an elaborate discipline around figuring out, case by case, what those things actually were. This is also why dishonor mattered more to a samurai than physical pain or even death. Nitobe puts it in a single image that stayed with readers for over a century. Dishonor is like a scar on a tree, which time, instead of effacing, only helps to enlarge. A wound heals. A scar on a tree only widens as the tree grows around it. A samurai who acted with cowardice or betrayal didn't just suffer a bad moment, he carried a wound that grew larger with every year he lived past it. That's an entirely different relationship to failure than most of us grow up with, and it's part of why this code produced men capable of the composure Nitobe describes elsewhere. A truly brave man is ever serene. He is never taken by surprise. Nothing ruffles the equanimity of his spirit. It's worth being honest about who actually lived this code, and how imperfectly. Bushido wasn't practiced by saints. It was practiced by a warrior class that also fought petty wars, served corrupt lords, and committed real cruelty in the name of duty. Nitobe himself doesn't pretend otherwise. What makes it worth studying isn't that the samurai were morally perfect. It's that they built an explicit, demanding standard for what a disciplined, honorable life looked like, wrote almost none of it down until a man half a world away from his own country finally did, and in doing so, left behind a working blueprint for self-mastery that has outlasted the class of warriors who built it by more than a century. In the videos ahead, we'll go through each of these virtues individually, straight from Nitobe's own 1899 text, and trace the lives of the actual samurai who defined what living by this code looked like, men like Miyamoto Musashi, undefeated in over 60 duels, and the 47 Ronin who waited 2 years to keep a promise that cost them their lives. This is the code that built them. The samurai class itself rose out of necessity, not tradition for its own sake. As Japan's imperial court lost its grip on the countryside centuries ago, provincial lords needed men who could actually enforce order and hold land by force, and those men, over generations, hardened into a distinct warrior aristocracy with its own rank, its own economy, and eventually its own unwritten rules of conduct. What started as a practical class of armed retainers slowly became something closer to a moral caste, expected to set the standard the rest of the country measured itself against. That's the part most retellings skip. Bushido wasn't handed down from priests or philosophers sitting apart from the fighting. It was built, virtue, by men who had to actually live inside its consequences, refined under exactly the pressure Nitobe describes: real war, real death, real stakes for getting it wrong. That's also why this code still has something to offer a viewer who will never hold a sword. Strip away the feudal Japan setting, and what's left is a rigorous answer to a question every serious person eventually has to face: what do you do when the comfortable choice and the right choice are two different things? Bushido's answer was never abstract. It was a working discipline, practiced daily, tested constantly, and passed down not by decree but by example, which is exactly why it survived long enough for Nitobe to still find it alive, unwritten, all around him in 1899. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Twice a day, we bring you Bushido straight from the source, the real words of the man who wrote it down, and the real warriors who lived it.